Welcome to the Marketecture podcast. Today I have got a great guest for us. So in addition to my regular co-host, Eric Franchi, we have one of the most well-known and respected analysts in the mobile world, Eric Seufert, also a contributor to Marketecture, a friend, and hopefully going to drop some knowledge on us. Eric, thanks for being here.
Hey, Ari. Hey, Eric. I'm very grateful for the invitation. I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to what will no doubt be a very interesting conversation. We're psyched to have you.
So if you don't know Eric, you should subscribe to his newsletter, the Mobile Dev Memo, and if you're very nice to him, he might let you in his Slack channel as well, which is one of the most active Slack channels I'm in, talking about everything about mobile acquisition. So how did you get started in this, Eric? I don't think a lot of people know kind of your background.
It's funny because, a lot of people think maybe I started Mobile Dev Memo to chronicle the developments with Apple's app tracking transparency policy, but no, Mobile Dev Memo is like 11 years old. Well, it started out just as a personal blog, and I kind of rebranded it. So I wrote a book called Freemium Economics, and it was published in 2014. And I rebranded that blog as Mobile Dev Memo then. So it's existed for a long time, but I ported all the blog posts over. So the content goes back to 2012. So the real reason is I was working at a gaming startup, and I was not very optimistic about its fortunes. And I thought it would be a good idea to sort of like as a hedge to start writing a blog about how freemium games grow, how the freemium business model works, how to achieve distribution, how to achieve profitable unit economics, and blog about all that stuff so that if the company failed, which it did, there'd be like some artifacts of, knowledge that I could point to in finding another job. And so that was
Right.
the sort of genesis. And it started out, and I wrote about those topics, right? It was very deep into kind of like the math of making freemium work. But the thing about freemium is that model, and when I say freemium, I'm referring to freemium apps, right? For the most part, that model is totally predicated on user acquisition, right? On profitable direct response marketing. That's how freemium products grow. It's almost like call it a law of physics or something. That's how they grow, right? That's what the freemium model facilitates, right? It facilitates super serving the most engaged and constitutionally relevant users. That's what freemium is. You get all of your revenue from some very, very tiny, often very tiny subset of users, and the rest are essentially free riders, right? So their use is subsidized by this subset that will pay. And so how do you ensure that the unit economics are profitable given that skew, which is often like in freemium apps 95-5 in a best case scenario? Well, then you have to be able to find those users that will contribute money that are the most relevant to the app. And the way you do that is with performance marketing, is with direct response performance marketing that is, supported by targeted advertising. And so those two concepts overlap.
Yeah, because if you don't continue to do the user acquisition, your game will eventually die because people will get tired of it. People don't play games forever. It attrits, and there's really no way to sustain a game in that category purely on word of mouth, virality, etc.
I would just point out here that I'm not exclusively talking about games. I mean, I'm talking about all freemium apps, right? So not just games, but yes, right? So the problem, so virality comes with its own burden, right? Virality can actually be really corrosive, right? Because it's not under your control by definition, right? And so what you see a lot of times, and I think Clubhouse is a really great example of this.
I was thinking about Clubhouse when you said that.
What's an app that's not ready for prime time takes off virally. You churn out users that might have been engaged with, the full functional suite, right, that you plan to build, and it's very difficult to get them back, right? And so the problem, and if you go like, just whatever, like if you have a Clubhouse type experience, you can't stop that, right? You can't slow that down. That's out of your control. And if everyone burns through your product and thinks, well, this was kind of novel, but there was nothing really retentive about it. There's nothing there that would cause it to become a habit for me. You've potentially burned through your entire total addressable market, right? And then how do you win those users back? They're not going to be viral again, right?
Yeah.
So you have to acquire them, and acquiring them will be much more expensive, right, for the second pass than it would have been if you had sort of like built this product and built out the feature set and built out, this robust experience and then tried to acquire those users. So virality, it can be a double-edged sword. And what you see a lot of times with these, especially, games, but apps, a lot of apps that have gone, truly gone viral, right, is that it was a shark fin, right? There's very few apps that go viral and then are, and then sort of are sustained by that.
I think it's also kind of impossible to get consumers to give you a second chance. If they download the app, they try it, and then it's they're not going back no matter what happens. I don't think there's any examples of that. And then it leaves in its wake, people like Matt Barish with his Clubhouse following.
Because there's one other piece here that I think is important. The qualities of an app, or I think kind of any product, the qualities of a product that allow it to go viral are actually sort of antithetical to the qualities of an app that features strong retention, right? That's another problem, right? So if an app if an app experience or a product experience is like, there's a lot of depth to it, the sort of content density to support strong retention, those apps are very difficult to make go viral, right? Because that just sort of like, that learning curve, right? Like there's the onboarding experience requires like almost like an investment on the user's part, right? And so those apps tend to not go viral. So the qualities that make a product viral also tend to work against that app in terms of just creating a stickiness with the user base that allows it to be compounded, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The retention is a key part of the economics, because if you retain users longer, you have more long-term value, and therefore you can spend more to acquire them, and your ratios still work out. But let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, ATT, Apple ATT. So what is, like, at big picture, is the world ended? I would say ending, but is it ended? Like, I've seen numerous announcements from on your newsletter and elsewhere that people say, the age of hyper casual is over, that the economics don't make sense anymore, things like that. What's the landscape look like for mobile acquisition?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, the entire world has a smartphone, right? And that's true, right? There's 7 billion devices out there, 1 billion iPhone. Those don't instantly become bricked, right? They're not useless.
I bet the economics.
Right. No, I get it. But it's yes, some categories of products will go away. Some categories of products owe their genesis to the sort of targeted advertising that was made available by Facebook, right? And that's not just apps either. That's a lot of D2C, a lot of e-com, right? And they owe their existence to that, right? I wrote a piece a couple years ago. I remember Chamath had a bee in his bonnet about the fact that 40% of the money that he, invested into startups was being spent on Facebook and Google ads. And I said, isn't that such a good thing? Isn't that wonderful? Right? That should be a reaction, right? It should be antipathy. It should be gratitude. Thank you, Facebook and Google, for creating this pathway to aggregating an audience. Thank you for giving this pathway to a very large and lucrative market, because absent that, these companies would not be investable at all.
Yep.
Right. And that was my point. I talked about D2C specifically because that was kind of the D2C, I think at that point, it was like 2018, that was like the peak of D2C. And so, well, what happens when those tools are blunted, right? What happens when those tools are degraded? Well, then those categories similarly will, see some sort of attenuation or negative impact, right? And so, it's not death of everything. It's death of the things that were very, very dependent on those pathways to the market, right? On those targeted ad products that, have been improving sort of very consistently year over year since like 2016, right? And so if you look at the performance improvements that those tools facilitated and the growth that those tools facilitated, well, then you can intuit, right? Then, the degradation of those tools or the elimination of those tools will have a similarly negative impact, right? And so you just kind of look at the spectrum. And I wrote a piece about this like in 2020 before ATT went into effect. And I said, look, it's called IDFA deprecation winners and losers, right? And I just took the entire spectrum of mobile and I categorized it. And I tried to have like, impact assessments for each, subcategory. And it was just red, green, yellow, right? And a lot of the reds were the categories, the portions of the spectrum that were totally dependent on that paradigm, on that targeted advertising paradigm, on the paradigm of let me build a profile of a user that captures their purchasing proclivities, and let me use that profile to target ads to them, and then also to assemble lookalike audiences on that basis. That's how you should, I think, that's how you should think about ATT and its impact. But I also want to make another point just quickly. It's really easy to sort of place, I don't want to say place the blame, but to think about ATT as like the singular instigation of this, but it's not, right? ATT is just ahead of this wave of restrictions that are inevitable and were inevitable prior to ATT being launched or announced, right? And so I think, it's a sea change. It's not ATT. It's a totally new paradigm about how user data is collected and is activated, right? And I think in a lot of ways, that's a really good thing for consumers. And so, marketers, you can stomp your feet and hate ATT, and you can point to what I think are, very credible questions around Apple's motivations with ATT, but you can't blame ATT singularly for these changes.
Sure. I mean, I think like if you think about the mobile device innovation as like this giant technical S curve, as the VCs like to call it, in a sense, like Facebook ads were like a mini S curve on top of that, and then that that flattened out, and on a little bit unexpectedly, it caused lots of carnage. Who knew that like selling a mattress was dependent on Facebook, right?
Right.
Yeah, D2C, the D2C business seemed like a great investable category, an exciting category. And then it turns out is overly dependent on one supplier. Unfortunately, there was a supplier of customers. So you brought up Facebook. So we have a little controversy here on the Marketecture podcast. So last week, I don't know if you listened, we had Brian Weiser. Franchi, help me out here. I screwed up his name last week. Is it Weiser? Who is a very well respected guru about predicting advertising spend and the global advertising spending, and he sort of poo-pooed the impact of ATT on Facebook's top line revenue. I believe your current estimate is somewhere in the 7 to 9% range. You could correct me in a second. And Brian was saying he thinks it's much lower, like 2%, and the rest of the other fortunes of Facebook are other factors. So I would love to hear your current estimate for what did ATT do to Facebook and, roughly how you came up with that number.
Right. So the 7% number comes from an article that I wrote in 2021, right? January 2021. This is prior to ATT going into effect, right? It's called Facebook may take 7% revenue hit from Apple privacy changes. And basically what I did was, I created, 3 scenarios, right? So there's a best case, base case, and worst case. And the 7% was a base case, but that was for the first quarter of impact. And then it decreased from there. The worst case was 13.6 and the best case was 2, right? So, and keep in mind, these are headwinds, right? So this is the headwind. So you'd net that out against the growth rate, right? So, okay, here's how I approach this. And that article approaches it in a similar way, but let me just describe my thought process, right? So let me just start with, and this is just a first principles analysis. If you want to dive into the data, right? So like there's a difference between just making a statement and then making an argument, right? And so what I'll do here is I'll just kind of go through the first principles, but I won't bore everyone with like, the sort of data that I would bring to support an argument. The data that I would bring to support an argument is available in an article that I wrote that was, widely read, called The App Tracking Transparency Recession. And I wrote that much more recently. That was last month or the month before, right? And there I sort of vigorously interrogate this question as I make an argument. And I'll get to like what the argument was in a second, but that's where I would suggest people go if they really want to dig into the data, right? And that's a data-based argument, right? So now if someone comes to me and they have data that contradicts that argument, then I'm happy to hear that, right? But what I would say is just starting from first principles. So let's start with a proposition 1. Did Facebook collect large amounts of user data to use in targeted advertising? Do we agree that is true? Yes. I think that's true. Do we all agree?
Sure.
Agreed. Okay. All right. So we're all agreed on proposition 1. Proposition 2 is, did Facebook's enterprise in collecting user data for the purposes of ads targeting, did that provide benefit, right? Was that valuable to them? Did that provide benefit to their advertising business? Right now, I would say yes. Do we all agree?
Yes, we all agree.
But I can support that. Like, so I would say if you question that, I wrote an article in 2017, right? So before ATT was on anyone's radar, I wrote an article called Facebook's App Event Optimization Tool Showcases the Power of its Data in Q1 Earnings. And so this was looking at what happened to ARPU when Facebook introduced AEO, right? So app event optimization. So that allowed Facebook to take these events, these specific conversions from users, collect them from pixels, from SDKs, use them to build a profile of users, around this history of conversions, and then target on that basis, right? And if you look at what happened when they did that, right, the growth rate, the ARPU growth rate in the US and Canada, which matched worldwide, right? So the growth rates were roughly similar. So the US and Canada growth rate matched the overall worldwide growth rate, ARPU, right, on an ARPU basis.
Wait, what was this?
So we're talking Q1 2017.
Okay.
So the change from Q1 to Q2 in ARPU growth rate, Q1 to Q2 for US and Canada and worldwide was roughly the same. It was high 15%, right, for both those buckets. And then Q2 to Q3, after AEO had been implemented, the US and Canada ARPU growth rate was double that of worldwide. Now, I would attribute that, right? And that matched almost precisely when AEO was introduced, right? And you can imagine that AEO would be more valuable in the US and Canada because that's where more of the conversions are coming from on like a per capita basis, right? They're going to have more of that per capita in that group, right? And so the growth rate doubled. It was double that of worldwide, right? And so I would attribute that to AEO. And so I would say, yes, that's support for the idea that we all agree that they collected the data, and that's support for the idea that the data helped them. It helped them target and helped them produce revenue, right? Okay, so that's proposition 2. Now, proposition 3 is, does ATT prevent Facebook from collecting that data? And I think that's just demonstrably true. I don't. First of all, why would they do it if it didn't? If it didn't do that, if it didn't accomplish that, why would they even do it? But second of all, I mean, you can look at what ATT does, and it severs those two sort of endpoints from being able to transmit data between each other by removing the IDFA, and then also layering all this policy on top of that to prevent other identifiers from being used. So if we all agree that ATT does that?
Absolutely. Confirmed.
So then I think we're all in agreement that ATT could, a sort of severe impact on Facebook's business. If we're all in agreement there, then we can just look at the data. Like if we all sort of agree on these propositions, then we can just look at the data. And what has happened to Facebook's business? Well, it has been, severely impaired recently. Now, and roughly in alignment with the rollout of ATT. Right now, is it just a coincidence? Is it the only factor? No, of course not. Of course, it's not the only factor. And I make that point in the ATT recession. I say, of course, the sort of COVID reversion to the mean in terms of user behaviors has also created a headwind. But the thing is, with the ATT recession, I point out, well, we can actually isolate those impacts in some ways, right? And we can say, well, like Google search is not really impacted by ATT at all. It just isn't, right? It's, browser-based. No. And so we'll look at the change in growth rates for Google search versus YouTube, that's part of UAC. That's Google's app install product, right? But also e-com advertises there. And there was that feedback loop with conversions. And the YouTube, starting from a much lower baseline, saw a much sort of like larger headwind in its growth rates than search did. Well, what else explains that, right? Because COVID would impact both, right? So that was the point I'm making, the app tracking transparency recession. So I would say like, if that's my sort of vigorous data-based argumentation there. But I think if you just look back to this stuff that I've been writing for a couple of years, I've been making the point for a couple of years that, wow, these products that Facebook rolled out and Google rolled out too, they really improved performance. And so if you believe that, then you'd have to believe that if those products were essentially disabled, that the performance would suffer to roughly the same magnitude.
So if you had to be pinned down to a number, what percentage did Facebook's growth decline?
I think it's high. I think it's the worst case. I think it was around 12%, 12 to 15%. I think it was very serious. And the thing is, look, these I'm sort of walking you through like, abstract theoretical exercises here. Just go talk to anybody. Just go talk to anybody that runs Facebook ads, whose business was dependent on that. And they'll tell you this was devastating. And you could talk to like a brand advertiser or someone at a big agency that works for Coca-Cola, and they'd say, what's ATT? What are you talking about? You know what I mean? And so like you have to kind of think about this from the perspective of what is the goal of that marketer. And so for direct response, especially for categories that were heavily dependent on Facebook and other platforms like that, Snap, TikTok, Google UAC, right? They would tell you the same thing. Right now, if you go talk to a brand advertiser, they'd say, it's had no impact. I don't know what you're talking about. What's ATT? I never even heard of that. And they'd be right too. Now, the question is, what proportion of Facebook's revenue is brand versus direct response? I think it's vast majority direct response, probably like 70%. Right now for Snap, it's not. Snap is lower, right? And YouTube's lower. But Facebook specifically was vulnerable to this, right? Given the high reliance on direct response and the fact that they were just frankly better at doing this than a lot of other platforms.
I want to move on from this. Let's talk about investing. So some of our listeners may not know that, Eric, you also run a small VC fund that focuses on mobile, called Heracles Capital. I am actually an LP in that, so I'm a little excited about that. So given the carnage, and Franchi, you jump in here too, what's investable in mobile user acquisition or mobile advertising or this whole world? Isn't it something you'd want to stay away from?
This is an area where we're not extremely deep in or focused on. So I actually want to ping it back to Eric S in a second. But good timing. There was an article on Ad Exchanger this week. We can put it in the show notes that points to the disparity in mobile gaming ad spend or overall gaming ad spend relative to like time spent by users or user engagement. And it was actually really interesting. Basically, people spend as much time playing games as they do on social media and slightly less than they do like watching TV. Yet the growth of gaming ads was like 7% versus the growth of social ads, 16%, and the growth of CTV, 30-something%. So, it just seems to me like a category that has yet really been embraced from an ads perspective. And I don't know if that's a data thing. I don't know if that's advertiser education thing. I don't know if it's like just the inherent nature of it. Is it less conducive to performance-based ads or brand-based ads? So it's somewhat confounding to me. And as a result, it's an area that, we continue to look at. I think there's an area that, we've got a couple of companies in the portfolio that there's like picks and shovels for, a la ad serving, so on and so forth. But, it seems like, a space that is just a little bit tough just because the investment hasn't yet been there relative to other spaces. So again, sort of like Eric, would love the meta thoughts on that.
So I would say that the Fund One, Heracles Capital Fund One, was very much thesis driven around this, right? So like the pitch, and this was, I raised the fund after ATT went into effect. Pitch was this privacy sea change is going to reshuffle the mobile ecosystem, like fundamentally. And there will be companies that lose a lot of market share, and there will be companies that essentially have to pivot or can't operate in the way that they were. And there will be new opportunities to do a lot of things that were part of the marketing workflow in a way that hews to the new privacy reality, right? And I will invest in those things because I know mobile really well. That was my pitch. And so, for instance, I've been really excited by a number of different, privacy safe measurement tools, like ads measurement tools. So things that use more of like an econometric approach to measurement, to new formats that fit into the product experience without being very disruptive, right? Because there'd be an expectation, right, that if the value of these ads decreases, that you have to increase ad load, right? I wrote a piece a couple months ago, and I was talking about Facebook's pivot, right? So Facebook's transition to the open graph and short form video. And I said, basically, there's 4 ways for any sort of ad platform to grow revenue, to grow advertising revenue versus increase ad load, right? There are problems with that. Like that there are consequences of doing that, right? You can increase churn. The second is to increase reach, so just get more users into the product and keep ad load the same. Or then there's the increase the value generated by ads, and that would be just to bring a lot more data to bear in pricing the ads and matching the right ad to the right person. And then finally, the increase engagement, increase session time, increase time spent. Right now, though, they're not mutually exclusive. You could have some combination of those, right? But I think we're seeing now that increasing ad load has been a tactic that many of these platforms have used. Like Facebook is a good example, YouTube's a good example, but basically everyone is having to do that, right? And if you have to increase ad load, well, then the ads probably need to be less intrusive, right? Because if increasing ad load tends to lead to increases in churn, right? So just new formats like that, and then content that is better suited to this privacy environment. So, like for instance, we talked about hyper casual games. Yeah, my belief is that this changing privacy environment has made it almost impossible for that category to operate profitably. And my sense is that's supported by a number of the biggest hyper casual games saying hyper casual is dead. For instance, Voodoo said at the VP of publishing, I think at Voodoo, which is a big hyper casual games publisher, said, yeah, hyper casual is dead. They said that at a conference. But a number of those companies have said the same thing. We're all pivoting, right? And I believe that's the reason, right? So what content is really conducive to being distributed in this environment. I think it's just like going really casual. It's going really so instead of like, but also with some monetization heft, right? So hyper casual was very, very easy to get the install, right? Again, it had that lack of depth that makes it easy to get people to click on the ad and go viral, and monetizing entirely through ads. And I think one thing that people don't appreciate about the hyper casual category is that the majority of ad revenue generated by that category was within the category. So it was hyper casual games buying traffic from other hyper casual games, right? So almost like a watch trade type situation, but it was supported, right? It was buoyed by the very extreme hardcore games doing IDFA sniping, right? So they were buying programmatically and they were looking for IDFAs that were known to them, and they were buying them from those hyper casual games because the average, sort of like the competition was less for those, right? So less for those impressions.
Yeah, so I'm just sort of shocked that I have two venture capitalists on this podcast. You haven't actually name checked any of your actual investments. You got to, the value add is you got to name the names.
Oh yeah, well, sure. Happy to do that. I didn't want to be obnoxious, but so I invested in a company called Incremental, and this was in their pre-seed round when it was very, very difficult to sort of convince VCs that this was a viable business. They do incrementality measurement, like online incrementality measurement, and they just raised their A. So I went. Okay. I was in the pre-seed, and then the pre-seed extension, and then it was a seed. Sorry, they raised their seed. Anyway, I've done a number of gaming investments where I think the content is well suited for this privacy environment. So a company BitOdd, they're out of Helsinki, where I used to live. The CEO is he was the principal PM on Clash of Clans. Asseterio, it's a tool that allows app developers, game developers to personalize ad experiences for players kind of in real time. Again, that's another piece of this, the impact here. If the CAC goes up, then you have to get more money from people. And if the users that you're acquiring are sort of like more anonymous, more heterogeneous, then you have to actually personalize the experience versus personalizing the ad that you show them. Firmat Commerce, they do sort of the same thing. I call it, content fortress in a box. That's an idea I came up with. But basically, they allow you to use on-site data to target the e-com ads. Anyway, I could go on and on. I don't want to.
Yeah, sure. Ed Franchi, you're in Cargo. Is that your one of your mobile plays?
That's correct. Cargo with a C. It is a shopping app.
Yeah, I'm in that too, and I think I'm also in Monetizer, which is a cool mobile ad network that focuses on brands. So good shout outs there. So we have a lot. There's so much we can talk about. So one thing I do want on a little bit of a lighter note. We had lunch last week at the Old Town Bar, and Eric, you told me this funny story about how you built an ad optimization system for Facebook using video clips, like just random video clips. Do you want to tell our audience about that? Because I just think it's kind of an amusing little technical story.
So I had started a company called Agamemnon, and it was like a analytics platform for mobile advertising teams, but it was really more of like a BI tool. So it did like cash flow projections. It was totally privacy safe. You used cohort aggregates. You didn't use any personally identifiable data. But anyway, it just allowed you to like sort of project out revenues. Because the thing with running UA team, UA for, a lot of these successful companies, UA is the biggest, like app companies, it's the biggest single line item expense, right? More than salary.
Right.
And so you're spending a lot of money up front to recoup it over a year or whatever, 9 months, a year, whatever the LTV projection is, or whatever, you've decided to use, with your own cash management system. And so like you're bearing a big upfront cost and you're recouping that over time. Right. And so you could very easily understand a position where like, hey, we're buying profitably in the sense that we're paying $1 for a user and we're going to get $1.50 back, but we're spending so much money up front that we're going to run out of cash, right, to do that. And so this tool was just, purpose of it was to sort of allow you to map the cash flows out to understand where the sweet spot was, right? Like where the optimum spend level was. Anyway, so that got acquired and I by a mobile gaming company, and I was building like a platform to, automate UA or to automate a lot of it. And what we realized was we were spending so much money on UA for this one game, right? I think we spent $80 million in 2018 on one game, UA for one game. And it was only mobile, right? So it's just installs. And what we realized was the true bottleneck was creative. It was the volume of creative assets that we had, right? Because what Facebook at that time and UAC, which is Google's app install product, and some of the other platforms were really good at doing was identifying like the sub audiences that were like sort of most relevant for our game. But we had to actually, the way to drive the sort of to maintain the economics while you're driving the volume of installs was to match those, groups of people with like creative that would fit, whatever their interests are. And so there's no way to preempt that. You just test, you just experiment. And so I built this tool called Draper. The sort of most primitive version of it was we just dumped a bunch of video assets in a folder, right? And we had purchased them from some stock video website. So we had like, I don't know, 1,000, and we dumped them in a folder, and we wrote a script that basically we had a separate folder with just in-game footage. And then we had this footage, all this just generic footage, and we would just make random combinations, just truly random. Really? And so we just make every permutation possible of all these different clips, and then dump them into a Facebook ad set and let Facebook do its magic in a test environment. And then we'd find the stuff, it would just filter out the stuff that worked, and then we'd promote that to like another ad account that actually put money behind it, like real money.
And so what performed?
Right. So what you're referring to and when we had lunch was, and again, we didn't know anything about these clips. We didn't want to know. That's the point, right? And I actually took this idea from a book I read called The Man Who Solved the Market, Jim Rogers, the founder of Renaissance Technologies. And his like epiphany was that I don't need to know anything about these stocks. I'm just going to look at the movement, and I don't need to know what the company does that makes the stock. If I want to trade these stocks algorithmically, I can do that by just looking at previous pattern. Right. And so that was my idea with this. Like, I don't want to have to intuit anything about what creative will work. I don't know, and I can't know. And so I'm just going to try everything. And so anyway, 1 week, I mean, we did this every week, and it was like two or 300 assets every week. But 1 week, the winning creative was just a video of gameplay, then that cuts to a video of a woman doing squats, and then more video of gameplay. And like, that was it. And like, I didn't make that. I didn't say, hey, you know what? I bet women doing squats will generate. I didn't have any knowledge a priori of what that was. It just happened to work. And so that was like an aha moment. Like, we don't know. You can never intuit what creative is going to resonate. You shouldn't try. You should just test stuff.
The internet never misses, and you're going to be canceled for this. So congratulations.
Yeah, I mean, that's not just to point out again. I didn't personally, like, this wasn't like art from my hand, right? This was just random output.
It's like the meme. There was a meme going around, or it was actually just facts that over time the ads for a given game would get raunchier and raunchier, and the princess in the game's cleavage would show more and more of being, just because the algorithm would tell the marketers to do that. Well, let's do
just to on that point. That's exactly what happened. That was the fake ads phenomenon. You've seen this. You've seen, like, it's not just like the lascivious stuff. It's just really weird, disturbing stuff. It's like, this woman's about to drown. You better save it. And that's the ad. And then you click, and it's like a farming simulator. You know what I mean? That's that fake ads phenomenon. But that's exactly the point. There's a lot of people that, like, true marketers who were like, probably disturbed by my view of this, of our shared pursuit here, which is that I'm not trying to tell a story. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I am trying to activate some impulse in your lizard brain that causes you to click. That is my goal, right? And I'm not wearing a beret and thinking up like some sort of like multi-part narrative of an ad flow or anything. I'm saying let's just try to activate that lizard brain, and you, the consumer, won't even know when you click. But I'll have just combined some set of pixels in such a way that you do.
There are a lot of machine learning engineers who wear berets, so I just want to defend them on that front.
Let's talk artwork for this episode.
So Franchi, was there any news this week? It was a pretty quiet week.
Quiet week. Just kick back, feet up. Not furiously trying to understand the banking system.
Yeah, so you're right in the middle of it. What's the ad tech angle here?
Yes, so we're recording this on Thursday, March 16th. A week ago today, there were rumors of SVB shutting down, being taken over by the government, and 24 hours later, that happened. Chaos, panic ensued. The ad tech angle here, I think, is probably twofold. So number one, Adweek, and again, we can put this in the show notes, they had a pretty interesting piece about how publishers and sort of like healthy ecosystem, there's some ad tech companies that are accelerating payments to publishers right now, just from a cash flow management perspective. And then Oryx, and it's just sort of like big credit facility company that's always been looming. They're seeing like spikes in inbound. So I think, that's interesting. I think the real thing here SVB was a super important bank to the ecosystem from two perspectives. Number one, a lot of venture capital firms used SVB to just like run the sort of day-to-day operations, right? So to the extent that there's interruptions in access to capital and rethinking of banking strategies, like I think investment probably sort of like goes on pause for a little bit, but I think comes back. But then on the other side, a lot of startups use SVB. They said up to 50% of startups. I think it's a little bit more like 30% that I've seen from like YC and even within our own portfolio. And beyond the banking, SVB was the largest venture debt provider, which many startups, particularly sort of like post-seed, would tap into for a source of non-dilutive access to capital. So with that gone, I think that's somewhat concerning. You could potentially see the sort of that being the acceleration of things like layoffs and down rounds and shutdowns. So I think the venture debt piece I'm looking at. I think on the other side of it, this I think just will probably spark some innovation around fintech that is probably well needed.
Ad tech and MarTech are marketplaces, similar to the financial marketplaces, and there are receivables and payables in many directions. But it hasn't in the past had anything you might think of as a contagion. One ad tech business going out of business is bad, but it doesn't have a domino effect where other ad tech businesses suddenly can't make payroll. Now, theoretically, it is possible that could happen if a big enough ad tech company were to default. But in general, the impact on various people has been, manageable. There have been clawbacks. There have been mispaid bills, unpaid bills. I'm yet to hear of any sort of horror stories in the ad tech world.
My fear there was so I looked into this a couple of months ago. So on the e-com and D2C side, like a lot of this UA spend or ad spend is financed, right? On the app UA side, that's true too. But on the e-com side, it's you have a line of credit with one of these companies that does this kind of, it's basically receivables financing. It's fact, right? But some of it has evolved to just being like looking on the basis of past cohorts, lending money, right? And the question to me was, I never got far enough. It just felt like it wasn't systemic enough to have an opportunity to make money on it, but as a trading idea. But I never got far enough to understand who was lending the money, right? So if that was SVB, which I wouldn't be surprised if it was, these companies wouldn't have access to those lines of credit anymore, and they would just have to stop spending.
Yeah, in ad tech, there's always been sort of this cottage industry of factors that focus on the area. I think FastPay and Orex are two of them that are very well known, but it's never been really that great a business, or it hasn't been made into a great business. And I think there is opportunity for innovation in fintech for ad tech.
We're going to see it.
Yeah, we're going to see it. Another piece of news. So Digiday reported an interesting story that not 6 months past the big blockbuster announcement that Netflix was depending on Microsoft for its ad stack and its ad sales, that they're getting a little itchy and they're looking for alternatives, looking to build their own ad server or buy. And the article specifically mentions my former colleague and friend, John Widdicombe, who used to be the CPO of Freewheel, is working as an advisor to Netflix in this effort. I don't know, hot takes? I have a bunch. Franchi, maybe any hot takes on this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Thinking about Netflix as an acquirer of ad tech is somewhat logical when you think about it, but they're brand new to the entire ecosystem. So I think hiring somebody with real chops to help them go through the build buy partner exercise is correct. And as a strategic acquirer, Netflix could acquire anything that they wanted across the LumaScape. So I think it gets interesting because you can now, basically any company would not be too large to be absorbed by Netflix. And, I think it's A, acquiring the tech, but then B, what does that mean for the legacy business? And is it a, really important scale business that they take out? It could end up being a bit of a reshuffling of the deck. So it's super interesting.
I have a lot of takes. I'll just run through my takes pretty fast. The first take is there's not too many people to buy. If you're looking for publisher side video ad serving, well, there's not too many people to buy. The leader, Freewheel, is very big and part of Comcast. Google, obviously. SpringServe got acquired by Magnite, and Publica got acquired by Integral Ad Science. Those two would have been certainly top of the list. There just aren't that many options. Second take, I would say, is I think my opinion is that this is a little bit of Silicon Valley, not invented here syndrome. that Netflix believes it at its heart that it's a tech company and should build its own tech, but there's really no good reason to. Their advertising needs are probably going to be pretty simple, and they could probably be very well served by a Freewheel or by Xandr, who they're already working with, but they probably feel like they need to own it in a sort of irrational way. And in addition, they don't want to be dependent on Comcast, who obviously in the long view is a direct competitor to Netflix. So I think they're kind of forcing themselves into this decision. Eric S., any thoughts?
I mean, this is not really in my wheelhouse. I think, but we did a Twitter Spaces on this, right? When it first got announced, you, me, and Barash, and I mean, I think that the general consensus at that time was that this was probably a temporary, like using Xandr was probably a temporary solution, and they're probably going to build their own ad tech. So it feels like that just is coming to
feels that way
to fruition here.
So what do we think? Is this a build or is this a buy? Because Partner seems to, have, frankly, sort of, kind of served its purpose again and kickstarted, but doesn't seem to be the path going forward. So build or buy? Go first, sorry.
I don't see any targets for buy. I don't think there are any good targets. So I say build.
Eric S.?
I would say build.
Interesting. Okay.
What do you say?
I think there's probably one or two targets out there, but you need to sort of peg the odds of successful M&A always against you. So you're probably right. It's probably the build rack.
There is a sort of a option to buy someone who's not directly an ad server, but is
Exactly.
in the video market. Someone like an SAI provider, server-side ad inclusion, is sort of this back room aspect of ad serving and video, and some of those companies are not directly affiliated with ad servers. But now I'm really talking off the reservation. So one more.
Transmit is a portfolio company, and they've got a lot of great assets, and I think LionTree made a great strategic investment, but it's an interesting company.
All right, we got a target. Last piece of news I bring up that caught my eye. So Uber and their continued effort to become an ad network, everything is an ad network, a little hat tip to Eric on that one. They announced their self-service portal for buying ads on the top of the cars. So car top ads in some jurisdictions are allowed. And it's an interesting space because it's digital out of home, which has not been the most liquid market historically, programmatically, and it's hard to measure. And there's a lot of interesting aspects to it. I guess I would put it in the context of, is this digital out of home's moment after 20 years of people talking about it, or am I just being too excited about this?
Yeah, I think digital out of home is having a moment. I think it's growing faster than other formats. I don't think that ads on top of cars are the killer app, nor do I think that this might even fit for the customer base of Uber ads that seem to be a lot of performance-based companies that are very focused on the app experience. So I know they're thinking about the article was interesting. Thinking about how do you incorporate this into some sort of like multi-touch attribution spin, but it seems to be a stretch that taxis or Ubers rather whizzing by in New York City are going to be like a great ads format for a performance marketer, let alone a brand.
Yeah, I think it's just one component of their push into advertising, which per the everything is an ad network slogan or whatever is pretty pervasive, right? But I think digital out of home is really exciting right now. I mean, in part because of that everything is an ad network trend, right? It's these direct response marketers have to go up funnel, and they have to build the measurement tools that allow them to measure that. And but if you do that, the problem before was like Facebook was just such a crutch. And the social DR channels were such a crutch. You were very much like moored to that type of channel, and a lot of companies built all of their infrastructure around that. And it's actually you can be very optimistic about the companies that are able to make that transition, because if you build the kind of measurement tools that you need to operate in this environment, again, no user level identity. Totally sort of anonymized, aggregated cohort level data. If you build that, then the whole world is your billboard, right? You can do out of home, you can do TV, you can do radio. If you build the tools to achieve that measurement with the digital channels. Now, the good news is you can apply those everywhere. And so I think there's a good reason to be optimistic about the state of digital advertising as that happens, right? And now it's going to be measurement led, and not everyone can do that. And I think there's advantages like the bigger companies. But if you can make that transition on the measurement side, then you can, the surface area of your deployment expands. And that's really exciting.
There was this slight renaissance in digital out of home, maybe 10 to 5 years ago, because the mobile devices had rich location data, and you could rent that location data very easily. You could correlate it to billboards and then create conversions. Luckily for privacy advocates and for the world at large, that loophole kind of went away, and there's far less location data available. And so that method of buying these ads kind of went away.
Right. Which I agree is a good thing.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's very context specific, very context driven, right? So where you might not think ads on top of Uber are the right play. We've talked about this before. We had an investment in Octopus, which was acquired by T-Mobile. Ads inside, when you've got a user that is all for all intents and purposes. Not saying this is in the wrong way, like captive, right? Like what else are they going to do except stare at their phone, i.e., the Uber app, or stare at a tablet on the headrest, i.e., an Octopus or the like? I think that becomes a really interesting ad medium. We've got an investment in a business called Tave. It's a very, very early stage. They do essentially sort of like connected TV inside bars and restaurants. The sort of ROI that they can point to just having like an engaged audience is pretty interesting. So it becomes a little bit less about just like slapping ads all over the place, a little bit more about like what's the context, where's the location, how does it make sense? But again, I think we're all aligned. This is a cool category.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely an interesting category, and there's also an interesting company. There's a shout out called Firefly. That's very heavily venture invested. I think they raised like $100 million to do mostly car top and taxi top ads. All right, let's call it. This was an awesome episode. If you don't mind, could you give us some star ratings? The amount of stars is at your discretion on the various podcast apps.
And a review. Leave a review.
And a review. Tell your friends. Do that sort of thing. So Eric Seufert, thank you so much for being here. Everyone should follow him and subscribe to Mobile Dev Memo.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for subscribing to Marketecture. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.